special guest, Mr. Ray Dalio.
Ray Dalio is a friend. I'm a big admirer of his. What he has built up in financial markets is incredible. He's the largest hedge fund manager in the world. He's a pioneer. He is a creative thinker. He has innovated enormously in financial markets, the way he looks at financial markets and the way he goes about his analysis. And I think that many of the things that he has applied to financial analysis and to the way he runs his businesses is applicable to our lives and to our country. And we're all here basically because we want to improve Brazil. This conference is put together by Harvard and MIT students, mostly Brazilians. We're all trying to improve Brazil by bringing more Brazilians together to talk about Brazil and making them have contact with people like Ray, who have been very successful. And rules of success are applicable in everything. I mean, you know, good rules of success in business are applicable for countries, they're applicable for your life, and Ray thinks a lot about these principles. He has written a book now, which is a bestseller at the moment, Principles, which talks about what he thinks and how businesses should be run. And he, like myself, is very interested in perpetuating his businesses and making what he has done well continue throughout various generations. So I think we have a lot to learn from Ray. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you.
And thank you to all the students of MIT and Harvard who put this together and hold it together. It's a lot of work, and I think what they're doing is going to have tremendous effects for Brazil over the coming years, and in terms of attracting new people in Brazil who want to do things better, who want to do things well, and make Brazil a better country. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Ray, for coming. Ray is going to make a quick presentation, and then I will ask him some questions, and then all of you can send in questions to me, and I will pass on those questions to Ray also. So he's going to talk for about 15 minutes and make a little presentation, and then we'll have a question session, and then there will be questions from the audience. Go ahead, Ray.
Thank you, George. Thank you for being here, and I'm going to go real fast because I want to try to pack in a lot in my 15 minutes. The reason I'm so excited to be here, or the reasons I'm so excited to be here, is first of all, I have an enormous admiration for this man. And then at the same time, I've written down my principles, and I'm urging him to write down his principles, because the principles are essentially recipes that we've learned along the way, and we want to pass that along. And I'm in transition from the second stage of my life to the third stage of my life. And what I mean by that is I think life goes on in 3 stages. In the first stage, you're children, you're learning, you're dependent on others. And then when you graduate and you move on, you're in the second stage of your life in which you're working and others are dependent on you and you're trying to be successful. So all of you, most of you, are now entering or in the second stage of your lives. It's beginning. And then you go to the third stage of your life, you're transitioning to the third stage, and the instincts change. No longer is it as much a desire to be successful oneself as to help other people be successful without you, so that they do great and you're free of the obligations. And so we both are transitioning from that second stage to the third stage. And so in my particular case, I did something that I kind of lucked into, which was to write down the principles as I was making those decisions. And that was very helpful. So one of the things that I want to pass along to you is the power of doing that. In my case, when I would make a trade, I would write down the trade, and then I would test and how that would have worked over a period of time. And then I learned that if I wrote down every one of my decisions when I was making them, I could be clear. It would crystallize my own way of thinking, and then I would be able to share those with other people and have them stress tested. And so I would become clearer. And then I learned that I could turn those into algorithms and actually make the computer make parallel decisions with me. And so at the point of transition, I had this inventory of principles that I would able to pass along and put in the book. And so I would encourage all of you, when you are making the decisions, when you're in the moment, to pause and to take the time to write down those decision rules, those recipes for making success. Think about this man and all of the successes he's produced, and wouldn't you love to have his recipes? So anyway, that's what essentially the book is. The important thing, I think, is for you to have your own principles which work for you. That's most important. What I'm going to do is pass along some of the principles that worked for me and tell you a little bit about that to try to get them out on the table, and then try to discuss them. So, okay, the way it looked, I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time. Okay, the way that it looks like for me is that I want to have my audacious goals. I always wanted to go after the big things. And then along the way, you encounter your successes and your failures. Okay, and your failures. And the failures are so much more important than the successes, because on the failures, you must be doing something wrong. So those are your learning opportunities, right? But people have an aversion to failures. Successes mean you probably did something right, and you're not going to learn much from your successes. So, but you will have your failures. And how you approach your failures, I think, is the most important thing. And so I have an expression: pain plus reflection equals progress. If you have the pain of your failure and you reflect in a quality way, then you will probably ask yourself, what would I do differently in the future so that the next time it comes along, I'll have a better outcome? And so that is where the learning of principles comes. We all learn this way. We learn those principles, and then we change the way we do things, and then we improve, and then we go after more audacious goals. So life looks to me like this looping process that's shown in the chart, and the way that it looks to me is that achieving success is a 5-step process. You do these 5 things, and you will be successful. And those 5 things is, first, know your goals. So what are the goals that you're going after? You have to be clear. You can't go after everything. And on the way toward your goals, number 2 is that you will encounter your problems. They're your obstacles, right? Okay. Embrace those problems. And then you have to diagnose those problems to get at the root cause. And often, the problems are you or people around you that might have your weaknesses. Everybody has weaknesses that stand in the way of their successes. So you can't just say, this thing happened to me. You have to own that. And you have to understand what the strengths and weaknesses that you have and the people around you have. And anyway, whatever your problems are, you have to diagnose them and accurately get at their root causes. And then once you have a design, then step 4, once you have a diagnosis, you can have a design of what do you need to do to get around those things, and you come up with a plan to do that thing. And then, number 5, you have to do that plan. And if you do that over and over again, you learn and you move closer to success and you do better and better. That's been my experience. I think that's been a lot of other people. And I think that people's attitudes about failure, the aversion to failure, is a real problem. I think sometimes people believe that, that because they have failed at something, that they're failures, or that there's something flawed in them, rather than this is just part of the learning process, which it really is. So anybody who's been tremendously successful will tell you and could take you through their failures. We don't talk about them as much as we should. I just want to, give you a story, and like my failure that changed my whole approach. In 1980 and 81, I had calculated that American banks had lent more money to emerging countries that those countries were going to be able to pay back, and that we were going to have a debt crisis, and that debt crisis would produce a big economic crisis. And it was a very controversial point of view. Here we're talking about something that could border on being a depression, very controversial point of view. And I calculated that, and then in August of 1982, Mexico defaulted on its debts, and as a result of that, I got a lot of attention. I was asked to testify to Congress. I was asked to be on the show Wall Street Week, and I won't tell you, couldn't have been more wrong, but I want to give you...
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Mitchell, it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be able to appear before you in examination with what is going wrong with our economy. The economy is now flat, teetering on the brink of failure.
You were recently quoted in an article. You said, "I can say this with absolute certainty because I know how markets work."
I can say with absolute certainty that if you look at the liquidity base in the corporations and the world as a whole, that there's such a reduced level of liquidity that you can't return to an era of stagflation.
Wasn't I arrogant? Incredibly arrogant. I look back at myself, I say, oh my God, how incredibly arrogant. I could not have been more wrong. That was the exact bottom of the stock market and the greatest bull market that we had. And I lost money. Bridgewater was just a small company then. And I lost money for me, I lost money for my clients. I was so broke that I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to help to pay for my family bills. Okay. And that painful experience was probably the best experience that happened to my life. It was one of that. I guess marrying my wife and having my kids might have been. But that's because it changed my attitude about decision-making. It gave me a humility that I needed, a fear of being wrong that I needed to balance with my audacity. It made me change my approach. It made me want to find the smartest people that I could find who disagreed with me so that I could stress test my thinking. And it changed my approach to making mistakes. So I went into this from thinking I'm right to asking myself, how do I know I'm right? And that notion of creating the open-mindedness brought me something that ended up us having an idea of meritocracy, and I'll explain to you in a minute. But I think the way it is there's knowing what you know yourself, and then there's, through humility, the ability to draw on the best thinking of other people, particularly those who disagree with you, so that you can raise your probabilities of being right. And so I really do believe that one of the things that I want to pass along to you, particularly as you come out of school, where being right is so rewarded and being wrong and having failures is something that people think that's a problem and an aversion. Rather, I want you to think about this. And so you're probably on a path toward thinking, I've got to know more, know more. And I want to say that you can also, through your humility, you can take in more. So in order for me to be successful, I wanted to go after my ideas, audacious ideas, but I wanted to work with independent thinkers who would disagree with me well. I wanted to create a culture of independent thinkers, an idea meritocracy. In other words, a system in which the best ideas would win out, something beyond just that was in my head. And in order to do that, I had to create a principled idea meritocracy. We had to go through this. We had our successes and our failures, but we always went into our learnings, and then from those mistakes, we would write down those principles that helped us, and then we would go on. And that's basically been the journey that I've been going through. So I have to have an idea meritocracy. And what do I mean by an idea meritocracy? I want to pass this along to you. It's not just the organization that you're in, but it's also the relationships that you have with anybody. Do you want to have idea meritocratic relationships with people? Okay, so what is an idea meritocracy? You've got to do three things to have an idea meritocracy. First, you have to put your honest thoughts on the table and let other people put their honest thoughts on the table. A lot of people don't do this. They don't share what they're honestly thinking. Okay, well, that's going to create a lot of confusion. It's not going to let you cut through it. So can you put your honest thoughts on the table and let other people put their honest thoughts on the table? Second, you have to know the art of thoughtful disagreement. You have to disagree well. You have to be able to take in what people are thinking, and with curiosity and fear of being wrong, so that you can take in that thinking as well as express yourself articulately. You have to make it a joyful experience, not an antagonistic experience. Most people think in terms of disagreement. They can't disagree. You can go to a restaurant and somebody could say, I like the food, and somebody's reluctant to say, oh, I don't like the food. Isn't that silly? So you have to appreciate the art of thoughtful disagreement. And then, like all relationships, if you have a disagreement that remains, you have to have protocols for getting past that disagreement. And when you have an idea meritocracy, you can have better collective decision-making, because great collective decision-making is so much more powerful than any individual's own decision-making. So the other thing is, you have to know what people are like. You have to know what you're really like, your strengths and weaknesses, and you have to know what other people are like. Can you get at these things? So we have a culture in which that's a very important thing. Requires a lot of struggle, but it's a very important thing. Like, question, do you really want to know what you're like? Your strengths and your weaknesses? Do you want to be open about what other people's strengths and weaknesses are? That's very powerful. I want to just give you a flavor for what this is like in Bridgewater. So I'm going to take you into a meeting that a week after the U.S. election, our research team held a meeting to discuss what a Trump presidency would mean for the U.S. economy. Naturally, people had different opinions on the matter and how we were approaching the discussion. The dot collector collects these views. It has a list of a few dozen attributes, and so whenever someone thinks something about another person's thinking, it's easy for them to convey that assessment. They simply note the attribute and provide a rating from 1 to 10. For example, as the meeting began, a researcher named Jen rated me a 3, in other words, badly, for not showing a good balance of assertiveness and open-mindedness. As the meeting transpired, Jen's assessment of people added up like this. Others in the room had very different opinions. That's normal. Different people are always going to have different opinions. And who knows who's right? Let's just look at what people thought about how I was doing. Some people thought I did well, others poorly. With each of these views, we can explore the thinking behind the numbers. Here's what Jen and Larry said. Note that everyone gets to express their thinking, including their critical thinking, regardless of their position in the company. Jen, who's 24 years old and fresh out of college, can tell me, the CEO of the company, that I'm approaching things terribly. This tool helps people both express their opinions and separate themselves from their opinions to see things from a higher level. When Jen and others shift their attentions from inputting their opinions to looking down on the whole screen, their perspective changes. They see their own opinions as just one of many, and naturally start to ask themselves, how do I know my opinion is right? That shift in perspective of going above it and seeing the full range of views shifts the conversation from arguing over individual opinions to figuring out objective criteria for determining which opinions are best. Behind the dot collector is a computer that is watching what all these people are thinking, correlates it with how they think, and communicates back to each of them based on that. Then it draws the data from the meetings to create a pointillist painting of what people are like and how they think. And it does all that guided by algorithms. Knowing what people are like helps to match them up better with their jobs. For example, a creative thinker who is unreliable might be matched up with someone who is reliable but not creative. Knowing what people are like also allows us to decide what responsibilities to give them and to weigh our decisions based on people's merits. We call it their believability. Here's an example of a vote that we took where the majority of people felt one way, but when we weighed people's views on the basis of their merits, the answer was completely different. This process allows us to make decisions not based on democracy and not based on autocracy, but based on algorithms that take people's believability into consideration. Yeah, we really do that. I don't, forget the tools, it doesn't really matter. It's just a commitment to the idea meritocracy is the important thing. And so the real questions I think that you should be thinking of is, what are the barriers and what do you do about it? And the big barrier we always encounter is the emotional barrier, the 2U barrier. There's an intellectual part of you that wants certain things, and then there's an emotional part of you that wants other things. So if I ask you to the questions, do you want to know your weaknesses? Do you want to look at your mistakes? Do you want that? Do you want to know what I think of you? Do you want to be able to tell me what you think of me? Intellectually, you would say, yes, I'd like to know my weaknesses. I'd like to be able to tell you what I think. I'd like to hear what you think. And then there's the emotional component of that. And that can be changed with practice. And I think it's the biggest question that you all are going to face, all human beings face, which is when intellectually the right thing to do stands in the way, stood in the way by emotional the right thing to do. What are you going to let be in control of what you're going to do? So just finish this up. So the real question as you go forward, I think that I want to pass along to you is, do you want these things and to what extent do you want them? Okay. Do you want to have an idea meritocratic decision-making? I think the greatest tragedy of mankind, practically, is people who are attached to wrong opinions because they won't stress test them. So do you want to have the best ideas win out, or does it has to be the ones that you want? Second question is, do you want to know what people are really like, you and others? You're going to have to make those decisions. Do you want to have this radical truthfulness and radical transparency so that you know what's really going on and there's less spin? It changes relationships. It's difficult at the time, but when you go through it and you know that there's trust and less spin. Transparency means, bad things happen in the dark. You make things radically transparent, like we tape almost all meetings for everybody to listen to and everybody gets to see it firsthand. And then another thing is algorithmic decision-making. This is a big thing, once you have your principles down and you have them written in English, what you can do is you can put them into another language, and that's in the form of algorithms. You could have them programmed in the computer and take in a lot of the data and help you in your decision-making. So that's what I wanted to get out now and then to discuss.
Ray, You have been very vocal about your principles. You have published a book about your principles now. You have told all your competitors how you operate, how the firm is managed. What keeps a whole bunch of more competitors coming up in the market and creating another Bridgewater?
I don't think that this idea of meritocratic decision-making process diminishes anything in terms of reducing it. I think that's like a win-win. I think it's a lot easier for me to deal with other entities if they're operating in this way than to operate in the indirect, politically charged kind of environments in which nobody actually knows what's true. So it's a win-win.
Okay. You told me that you have applied some of this mythology to analyzing how countries are doing and how they will do better how they will do in the future or not. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. Look, I believe that everything that happens for reasons, and that pretty much the same things happen over and over again, and that often we don't see the patterns. So that those countries which are successful, I think you're talking about countries, the work that we did on countries as a whole, those countries that are successful or those countries that are unsuccessful are successful and unsuccessful for certain reasons, in much the same way as if one was to say, what is your longevity? Your longevity may be a certain amount of DNA, but it's a certain amount of how you're living, and you could take blood tests and examinations, and in my business, which is economics, converting economics into management and markets, I then went into trying to say what will the next 10 years growth rate be by looking at these various health indicators. And so that's what I did. And
how does Brazil look?
So, okay, let me just put that. You have to bear with me here while I'm sorry. What I wanted to do is, I'm just going to read the health index. Look, there's a cycle. You went through a typical balance of payments crisis, and that draws a lot of attention up close. And then there are the fundamentals that are the longer-term fundamentals that determine the longer-term growth rate, let's say the 10 years growth rates. And if I was to look at this health index, and by the way, I'll be happy for, I think it may be even on our website, I'll be happy to make sure it's on our website so that you could see the data directly and you could dig into it and tear it apart as you like. It looks at all different countries and where they are. And Brazil, the most important driver of a country's next year's 10 years growth rate is what the cost of an educated person is. Not just educated, are the people well educated, but if they're well educated and they're expensive, it's very different than if they're well educated and inexpensive. So that's a factor. The level of indebtedness is a factor. That's number 2 factor. If more indebted, more problems in the future, less growth. Less indebted, more growth. And then the third factor is very much a cultural factor, and it has to do with attitudes about work and approaches. And Brazil in these categories, if I take the range, falls right now sort of in the middle of those the first categories in terms of the education per capita and the education and the costliness of the education. And if you were to take the level of indebtedness, it's sort of in the middle. And the challenges that exist have to do with measures of cultural measures, such as on a scale of, let's say, self-sufficiency, which is measured by a number of statistics. The average hours worked, the labor force participation rate, effective retirement age, vacation hours, and such. Brazil is you start to see the pattern. You lower on the notion of is it a priority? Is work a priority? There's a category here which is savoring life versus achieving.
How do Brazilians look there?
So it's a number of things like work weeks, labor force, effective retirement rates, questions like hard work leads to success. These are questions that are given in many cases over the last 60 years to a number of countries. Does hard work lead to success? Is competition harmful? And then the question is it important to this person to have a good time, or is it important to this person to be successful? Economic question like economic growth is more important than the environment. Countries that will put the environment first will tend to have a higher priority than the environment. I'm not saying these are choices that anyone should make, by the way. I'm not expressing any thought. I'm just saying that there's a notion of let's call it savoring life versus achieving. On that, Brazil is the third lowest of 20 countries. In other words, the objectives are not as much toward the achieving as saving life, savoring life. And by the way, you do such a fabulous job of savoring life. You know, it is real. It is innovation and commercialization. Is it a country in which commercialization is important? In other words, that objective versus, and is innovation important? And on those numbers, they're lower numbers. And then there's the corruption index. There's a negative 52% correlation between a country's corruption rating and its next 10 years growth rating. And Brazil could do better on that. So those are, I don't want to digress too much, but there's an index here, and you can go through the index and just find where you are. But I think that if I was a leader or a to-be leader, I would want to look at those benchmarks, because those benchmarks serve to be metrics too. What we do is we show you that if you could change that number by a certain amount, like changing whether you're smoking or not, or you were to exercise more, you could see what impact that would have on the growth rate. And so while there are cycles, there are debt cycles, there are balance of payment cycles, they come and go, there's the stronger question over that period of time is the question of productivity, and then those are the trade-offs that you have to choose for yourself. You don't, each of us, that's savor life versus achieving, that's a tough question. So, and I'm not saying one is better than the other, but that's what it looks like.
Ray, you've dedicated a lot of time to finding good people and training great people. So, of your best finds, how would you describe them in 3 attributes?
Well, I think the most important quality of a great person is a mixture of curiosity, determination, and humility. I would say those are the elements. And traditional IQ, it's a good thing to have, but it's not anywhere near as important as these other things,
How many great people do you have in your organization?
I think I guess the question is in relation to what? I think, let's say, people are great in different ways, right? We try to have no, not great people. But it's important to realize that a person who pays a lot of attention to detail and is meticulous, and then somebody who pays big attention to the big picture, nature made every quality for a reason. And they need each other. And so it's really important to recognize that they're great in different ways. The way that I've described, Bridgewater or the qualities that you're looking for in terms of the greatness. I think most of our people are great in that way. At least I strive to, and we strive to make sure that that's, and because there's a culture of doing that, then it does weed people out who are not determined and open-minded and curious.
You encourage a culture that accepts mistakes, leaving aside unethical behavior, which is obviously not acceptable. What other mistakes may not be acceptable?
Most importantly is dishonesty. My definition of dishonesty is totally different than what I mean. I think most people think dishonesty means you're stealing. No. I mean you say what you think, and that there's no duality, that there's no integrity means being the same on the outside as the inside. So that's what we strive for in terms of that. And so if you have that and you have the willingness to learn from mistakes, you have most of what's required.
Ray, I've read that you meditate every day. How has meditation come into your life, and how does it affect your business and your happiness?
I do Transcendental Meditation, and I would say it's probably been the single most important influence on whatever success I've had in my life, because it has given me an equanimity and a creativity. The way it works, I recommend it to everybody. The way it works it's just an exercise where you repeat a sound, a mantra they call it, and the sound doesn't have any meaning. And by repeating that sound, think of it as maybe something like Om, and by repeating that sound, your mind goes from your thoughts, which are jumping around, to getting rid of those thoughts. It is now on the Om instead, and then eventually the Om disappears, and then you go into your subconscious mind. You're neither conscious nor unconscious. You're very relaxed, but you have no thoughts. And in that state, you're in your subconscious mind. And what happens in your subconscious mind is that's where the creativity comes from. It's like if you want to be creative, you don't go out there and work hard at being creative. It's more like you take a hot shower and a creative idea comes to you and you want to grab it. It comes from your subconscious mind. And having that equanimity and that creativity has been valuable. So let's say thoughtful disagreements. To avoid the emotional hijackings, to be able to be thoughtful, to be able to go pain plus reflection, to do that is something that's enhanced by meditation.
Do you set a special time to do it? Or?
I usually do it for 20 minutes before I have breakfast, and then I'll do it usually in the evening just before dinner.
I see.
But if I can't, I'll do it whenever I can. I've been doing it since 1969, so for a long time.
Pretty good. Ray, can you tell us a little bit about the world, how you see the world now and the markets? You know, you're one of the most successful investors this last decade, and so we're all interested in learning more about how you see the world at the moment and where it's going and where there are opportunities in the market.
I did a little 30-minute video called How the Economic Machine Works that creates a little template. And so just to make it simplified, there's productivity over a period of time, and productivity output per man hour comes from learning and doing things better, and we raise our living standards. And around that, there are two debt cycles, to oversimplify. There's a short-term debt cycle, which we're used to, recessions, contractions. You've gone through a balance of payments adjustment, which is along those lines, so there are these cycles we're used to. They typically go on for 5 to 10 years. And then there's also a long-term debt cycle. And the long-term debt cycle happens when things change, when a country, like the United States and a reserve country, hits a zero interest rate. Because normally, when you have not an adequate amount of weakness, you have an economy that's too weak and you need to stimulate it, you lower interest rates, and then it changes the capital market structure. Cash has a lower return than bonds, has a lower return than equities, and when central banks do that, and essentially and those spreads are created that way and they put liquidity into the system, it causes financial assets to rise and so on. So when we got to the point where the United States and Europe and Japan, the developed countries, had hit zero interest rates, and we had to go to the printing of money. In other words, the purchases and expansions of balance sheets to bring money. Into that, there was $15 trillion of purchases of financial assets in order to make that work. And that $15 trillion, actually a little bit more than that, of those purchases meant central banks bought bonds and the like, that sellers of those bonds take the cash, they buy other financial assets, those assets go up in price, liquidity goes to the system, and then there's a certain amount of trickle down. And so when I look at the world as a whole, that's been the main cycle that we've been through. But the trickle down is much less effective than it was in the past for certain economic reasons, having to do with technology is replacing people. In other words, if you look at the economy as a whole, you get one picture. If you break it into its pieces, let's call it the top 20 or 40% of the economy, and look at the bottom majority of the economy, we have a situation where the conditions for the economy as a whole, the majority of people have not worked well. Those living standards have not risen. There's not been there's technology, there's globalization, there are those factors, and as a result, we have populism. So we're now in a period of time where the wealth gap is very large, and capitalism, for the most part, is not working for the majority of people. If capitalism doesn't work for the majority of people, and you have that gap, and you share a budget, and you have an economic downturn, you have a set of circumstances that's unique. So if I'm looking at the capital market structure, and I can see that central banks can't lower interest rates much below zero, where they are, and not much, and they can't raise interest rates much above where the bond yield is or where the equity expected returns are, because if they do, if you raise interest rates that's faster than discounted in the markets, since that discount rate carries through all asset prices, you will cause the asset prices to go down, because all assets are a lump sum payment for a present value cash flow. You raise that discount rate. So think of the interest rate as being, let's say the bond yield, and let's just call that, depending on the country, 2 or 3% or whatever, and now that. And we have a leveraging up. I think we're late into the economic cycle, comparatively late. We've had a stimulation in the form of a fiscal stimulation that we're going to have into capacity constraints. So the way that I would look at it, just going forward from here, is that we're in the part of the short-term debt cycle, economic cycle, in which it's going to be more and more difficult for central banks to get it right. And so whether it's a year or two, where we'll probably come into, before the next election, presidential election in the United States, I'll focus on the United States. The same picture would be broadly true in Europe, to some extent in Japan, and then we can get into the emerging. China's an interesting case. But generally speaking, we're going through a shift in which I worry about a year or two ahead and having an economic downturn. Because I think if we have an economic downturn, this issue of polarity, this issue of populism, and the conflict between the rich and the poor in that kind of environment can create political disruptions that can make things more difficult. In other words, these are the great time. We're at near the peak of the markets. we're in the low point of unemployment rates around the world and so on, and we have a lot of tension between those participants. And so I would say I'm concerned about that disparity in wealth and where we are in the cycle.
A rocky road ahead.
It'll be interesting, I suppose, yeah.
All right. 20 years from now, how will you measure your book, Principal Success? What would you hope that to achieve by having written this book? And how will you evaluate Bridgewater's success 20 years from now?
I think that, like anything, you pass along things, and I think nobody will remember the book, and nobody will remember, and it's like teaching. If it has an impact that's beneficial to people along lines of the idea of meritocracy or those kinds of things, then I will have contributed something, I guess. In terms of Bridgewater, it's like going from one generation to another. We have children that are about the same age and who are adults, and when we look at them, I think we judge them by will they be happy and healthy? If they're happy and healthy, and we have contributed to an environment in some way so that they're happy and healthy to get the things that they want, not the things that I want, then I think that we will have done a good job in our roles.
Ray, I'm going to move on to the questions from the audience now. I haven't seen them, so... when you fail, how do you assess that your diagnostic is correct?
Largely by triangulating with others, and so I do a few things. I try to go back and I try to study history, the same things happening before if I can. It depends whether it's economic history, it's my personal failure. But the most important way I do is I find the smartest people I know who disagree with me, and I try to take it in, and I need the feedback. We never can view ourselves, I can't view myself objectively, and other people can't because we have those blindnesses. So if I get the triangulation, going out and saying, what do you think I'm weak at? What do you think I'm doing wrong? And if I get triangulation of people I admire, it helps me.
This is from Carlos Costa. How much of a challenge does the rising wealth gap pose to the stability of democracy, especially the United States?
A lot. A lot. If you look at the 1930s, I think is a very good period. 4 major countries chose to go from democracies to dictatorships or autocratic leaderships. Germany, Italy, Japan, and Spain, because they were at a stage where there was the same wealth gap, there was a large wealth gap. Today in the United States, the top 1/10 of 1% of the population's net worth is equal to the bottom 90% combined. So just as a general principle, if you have a large disparity and you're sharing a budget, how to divide the pie, and you have an economic downturn, you are going to have anger. And when that anger becomes almost dysfunctional, this has been through history, you could see it particularly in the 30s, when that anger makes countries less efficient, the democracy itself can become a very chaotic decision-making vehicle. Somebody says, will somebody get control of this place? And there's a real pressure to move toward autocratic leadership as to bring about control and order to a chaotic situation. And I think that that's a problem now. So I think it's a problem because capitalism isn't working for the majority, and I think that there's a lot of disorder, and I think it would get worse if we have an economic downturn. So yes, you'll go through history. Plato's Republic shows the cycle. They start off with the benevolent despot, in other words, the benevolent leader who's autocratic and they have the leadership. And then the idea is, and with time, not all leaders are either benevolent or capable. And then you have corruption, or you have whatever it is. Then you have a revolution. Then the revolution leads to democracy. And then democracy goes on and it becomes disorderly. And then you have a revolution, and then these things happen. So we can't, if we have a longer term perspective, we can't take for granted democracy. Democracy can be dysfunctional itself, particularly in chaotic situations. So yeah, I think that there are risks.
What do you think of the Chinese meritocratic system?
I actually think it's pretty good. Okay, so I've had, it's very interesting. I've had a lot of contact with in the system and operating. It runs more like a big corporation than it runs like a like we think of. Ironically, there's a succession pipeline and different points of view within it, and then these people work themselves up like a corporation, quite like your company. They work themselves up, they get meritocracy and so on, and then there's conflict within it, okay? So it works like, so the main thing is that they would say that a democracy, one man, one vote is a different story. Their perspective is very much a family perspective. It's been pointed out to me by one of the leaders that the characters for country is state, family. That's what the two characters together make that. And so the way they think of it is kind of a family. Every system has its back, the good and bad, but we're seeing in China now the development also, very market-oriented economy, very good rule of law in terms of the improvement in the element of the rule of law. And so we're seeing orderliness and the likelihood that that runs out of control, I think, would be less. And the capability, I've had the pleasure and honor to know the leaders, and I would say I rarely find somebody who's not very capable or very devoted to the mission. So by and large, I think it's not what people think it is. Most people think of it as being something very different. It's not communism, as we know communism. Okay, so and it's a very generally speaking effective decision. Now, there's a cultural issue in terms of debate and openness and how you can. So I would say it certainly doesn't have that same element, except if it's done in private. So conversations, I found my ability to say whatever I want is appreciated and taken in a way that is probably not widely recognized. So by and large, I think it's much more effective, much less likely to become disorderly.
Wikipedia calls you a philanthropist. Could you explain what you have been doing in that area?
Well, I, like yourself, you get to a point where you have enough resources, and basically, my own view is, I just want to go do what I want to do. And in many cases, going to have a beneficial impact on others or the environment or something is something that I want to do. So my own approach to it has been very family-oriented. My family is very important to me. So the way that I've done it is we make it a family activity. And I think it should be, for myself, passion-driven. We each have our own passions. And so we have, I've got 4 sons, 2 daughter-in-laws, and I'm perhaps a third on the way. And I'm in a position where we say we have the family activities, and we have a very eclectic philanthropic approach because everybody has different passions. And that's the way we've approached philanthropy. And the way we look at it is we almost don't think of it as philanthropy per se, like we're giving away. It's like, what do you want to do? Because everything is in profit motive. And so you can get a joy out of being able to have certain impacts, and that's how we each do it. Now, we set up our rules. There is a governance structure. How much can somebody give? How do you track it back? Doing philanthropy well is as difficult, or maybe more difficult, as being successful in your business.
No doubt. How do you train people to be good at thoughtful disagreement?
The first is to get them to say, do you intellectually want it? In other words, if we're going to have a relationship, how are we going to be with each other? Is it your responsibility? Do you want to be able to take in and communicate? And if you take in, then I can take in. And so what are our terms of engagements intellectually? So by first intellectually wanting it, then they go into the experience of it. And when they then have disagreement, then they can reflect on themselves. By being able to reflect on oneself in that moment, okay, am I calm? Then we have rules of engagement. In the book, I've listed a number of rules of engagement, like a 2-minute rule, okay? I'll impose my 2-minute rule. That means you be quiet, and for 2 minutes, I'm going to convey this concept, and we'll time it, but you'll listen for 2 minutes, so that there are certain protocols, but you have to want it, and then you will observe yourself struggling with it, and that's okay, and then you get better at it.
Here's a good one. Would you invest in Brazil now?
Yeah, we have invested in Brazil now. Do you know we move a lot?
Radical transparency worked very well for you. If it's that efficient, shouldn't we expect more companies to adopt it? Shouldn't it be the standard? Why isn't it?
I think it will. I think the answers to the first two questions are yes, yes. And I think it will increasingly be the standard just because of evolution. What's going to happen, first of all, is that nowadays, everybody can see what everybody's doing and know what everybody's like, pretty much, because everybody's leaving fingerprints of themselves all over the place. Okay, so there's the data, okay? And it is an evolutionary reality that great collective decision-making is better than individual decision-making. And so we can do this with algorithms. And then also, I really do believe it will be perceived as a right. Like, I would say that the most important thing for a lot of you people as you're going into the company is to believe that you have the right to make sense of things. If you are dealing where whoever your boss is and wherever your company is, or country, and you're saying, it doesn't make sense to me, and I want to ask questions as to why it makes sense, and you're being denied that right, then recognize that you will never be able to adequately develop intellectually. You will never be able to be in a position where, you know, you can adequately develop. And if we were to hold people back when they genuinely want to make sense of it and we're not letting them speak up, that bottling it up and that lack of development will stunt their growth. And I believe that you're going to want that and you're going to carry it. And I believe organizations will find it easier to attract you if they offer that. And so I think it'll make better decision making, and I think it'll make it better environments that will attract people. So I believe that evolution will drive it in that direction.
We've run out of time, so there's one last question here. Did you have time at the Harvard Business School to learn many of the principles you have now adopted or not? Did something come from there, or did you learn them later?
I learned them mostly later, but Harvard Business School was great in that up until my education, for the most part, it was learn what other people were teaching. You know, they would tell me, remember these things, and then the test would be, did you remember these things? And in Harvard Business School, it was the first time of a bright spot in basically saying, here's a situation, and now you're in that situation, and what do you think? And so it moved more toward a thinking experience. So that was better than the traditional remember this, and I'll grade you on how well you remembered it. But I would say my learning began when I moved from that first phase of my life of being a student and getting prepared to do, to actually going out there and doing and encountering those realities and then reflecting on it.
Oh, well, there's about 100 questions here. I'm sorry, can't do them all. I'll ask one from my friend Veronica. She's right there. So she wants to know what your next big challenge is.
Well, my challenge is now to pass along the things that have been helpful, and I think I'll do that probably for about another year, and then I'll be done with that. And then increasingly, it's the joy of just the excitements without obligations. And you know, like I have ocean exploration is a thing that's exciting to me, you know. My family, making sure that my family is great, spending time with my family is a joy, but basically to be totally obligation-free and to feel, to make everything just a joy, you know.
Well, Ray, thank you very much.